Then standing back, he made it plain that the nightmare would never ever rise again. But the fear and the fire and the guns remain. It doesn't matter now, it's over anyhow. He tells the world that it's sleeping. But as the night came round, I heard its lonely sound. It wasn't roaring, it was weeping. It wasn't roaring, it was weeping. And then one day, the neighbors came. They were curious to know about the smoke and flame. They stood around outside the wall, but of course there was nothing to be heard at all. My friends, he said, we've reached our goal. The threat is under firm control. As long as peace and order reign, I'll be damned if I can see a reason to explain why the fear and the fire and the guns remain. It doesn't matter now, it's over anyhow. He tells the world that it's sleeping. But as the night came round, I heard its lonely sound. It wasn't roaring, it was weeping. It wasn't roaring, it was weeping.
Ready to take apart a word that literally means separateness. Aparthood, apartheid. Let's see if we can't wrap our heads around this racial discriminatory policy of South Africa that lasted for more than 50 years. So kids in school, lifelong learners, and cray-cray and the internet, get ready as we go giddy up for the learning and go get her done right now. So guys, before we get to apartheid, and again, this is going to be a word that literally means separateness. This is a policy enacted by the National Party of the South African nation in 1948. But there's history before that that's important because it's a different history than a lot of other British colonies, and that's what South Africa was for a long time. But before the British came, there were Portuguese. We won't talk about the Portuguese, but the Dutch East India Company, which is going to discover Cape Town, again, geography, this awesome port on the southern tip of South Africa in the mid-1600s. They saw it as a refreshment colony, a place where their sailors, their merchants could stop on the way to making these awesome trade deals around the world. Now, the Dutch are going to settle there. They're going to be called Boers. They speak Afrikaans, and that is a West Germanic language. So that's a different ethnic heritage history, the Dutch settlers, than the British when they come in the next century. Now, the Dutch are certainly going to have their own problems other than the British. They're going to be the Cape Frontier Wars when they're fighting the indigenous people that live in the inland to this port that they have discovered and they're living around. But the British are going to roll in around 1800, and they're steadily going to take control of the colony. And then eventually we're going to have the Boer Wars between the Anglos, the British, and the Dutch. But eventually, long story short, the British are going to create this as a colony, coexisting with the Boers, the Dutch colonists that came before them, and then really treating blacks, indigenous blacks, as the others, putting them on reserves, fighting them. There's going to be the Anglo-Zulu Wars, and there's also a long legislative colonial history of racial laws that are going to segregate, disenfranchise, and treat blacks different. Before we get to the Union of South Africa in 1910, we would characterize it by saying there's a strong master-slave kind of thing going on in South Africa. So as South Africa forms as a nation, racial segregation isn't going to be a new thing, it's going to be reinforcing an old thing. You have to remember the whites putting together the Anglos, the British, and the Dutch make up a small fraction of the general population of the people of that land. Maybe they're 15% to 85%. But they're going to control 85% of the land. So certainly there is racial history to be known. Now, even though slavery was banned by the British Empire in 1833, they're going to have an indentured servants system. There's a pass law system where black people had to have passes if they were traveling anywhere into the colony. So they're definitely being treated as outsiders before we get to the Union of South Africa. And that's eventually what we get to. In 1910, the Union of South Africa is formed. It's a dominion of the British Empire, and then slowly it's going to achieve its own independence. But it's a country by 1910. So let's take a quick look at kind of the legislative history of racial stuff before we even get to apartheid in 1948. So hip hip hooray, we're going to take the different colonies, and in 1910 we're going to combine them into South Africa, the Union of South Africa. So this is pre-apartheid. In 1910, we get the South African Act, which is going to ban black representation in Parliament. It's going to fully enfranchise the white race. They're now in charge of the other races. And then a series of acts like the Native Land Act, the Natives in Urban Areas Act, the Urban Areas Act is basically going to forcefully remove black people that are living with white people to be putting on what they call reserves, moving them out, strengthening pass laws, and basically doing everything they can to segregate blacks from whites. And then there's also coloreds. There's mixed race people that during that time period, it depended where you lived. Coloreds could vote. They didn't have direct representation, but they had white representation in Parliament. But all of that's going to go away when we get to apartheid. Now, it's important that you kind of see this through the lens of World War II, because as World War II approaches in the 1930s, the people that are very nationalistic, the Boers, the Dutch, they're not very fond of the British. So they really don't want to go into World War II supporting the British. So an alliance occurs between the British population and the colored races to form what's called the United Party. And the United Party is going to jump into World War II, support the Allies, but there's unintended consequences. And one of those is there's a huge explosion during that time period of blacks that are migrating to cities for jobs because of the absentee whites that are going to fight the war. This is going to create racial friction. There's going to be a backlash, and that backlash is going to be seen in 1948 with the election of the National Party. This is a party that is very Dutch, Boer, nationalistic orientated, and they're playing on the fears of this large black majority that's going to conquer and take over this white minority. So they get elected, and now we have apartheid. So in 1948, guys, we get the election of the National Party, the Afrikaners, who are going to institute what is going to be called apartheid, literally separateness, aparthood. It's kind of like Jim Crow. If you know anything about Jim Crow, and we have a video if you don't, it's in the description, but this is basically the social customs and political laws of the southern states in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. So this is much more centralized and much grander on idea of really creating separate societies. We're going to get the Population Registration Act. This is going to divide the population into 4 categories: white, black, colored, and
Asians,
and into 13 racial federations where you guys got an ID. They had a commission or a board determine what race category you fell in. And that, when we get the Group Areas Act, is going to literally determine where you live. The grand idea is to take these reservations, which are from the British colonial times, and turn them into homelands and eventually independent countries of self-rule. But of course, there is real no self-rule. Everything is being ruled through the NP, the South African government. The Prevention of Illegal Squattings Act gave the government the right to knock down urban areas in white cities and then basically, move them out. You got a pass if you could work in the city, but your family and everybody else would live in one of these homelands. There's going to be the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act and the Immorality Act, which are going to ban any type of marriage or sexual relations between the different races. And then the Reservation and Separate Amenities Act, which is big-time legal segregation. Segregation in public parks, in beaches, in restaurants, in hotels, in trains, anywhere there might be interaction, there's going to be separateness in this new policy. We're going to get the Suppression of Communist Act, and the government used this to basically ban opposition. It's at the height of the Cold War, so if you were complaining about apartheid, you're probably going to be labeled as a communist, and we'll talk about the ANC in the next section of this video. And then we get the Bantu Education Act, which is creating a different educational service and law for blacks, coloreds, and Indians, which is much subpar to the white race. And then the Bantu Authorities Act and the Black Homeland Citizen Act is literally going to strip citizenship away from black people and force them into these homelands. And eventually the idea is to create these independent states. But of course, they're really not going to be independent. They're just going to be away from the white races. So apartheid is all-encompassing. Every part of society in terms of where you worked, where you could work, where you lived, what language you spoke, what school you went to, who you could interact with, falls under the umbrella of apartheid. But luckily, not everybody is cool with apartheid. So now why don't we discuss some of the opposition, as eventually we have to rid ourselves of this system of racial injustice. So the fiercest resistance to apartheid is going to come from the people that live within South Africa, internal resistance. Now, it's formed in 1910, South Africa. By 1912, we have the African National Congress, which is basically a resistance group to this new South African government, where they see themselves as not having any representation. So they're going to fight for themselves. And certainly with Gandhi in India, that's going to be a big message to lots of people in South Africa that there's a way to fight against this system. Now, when apartheid is enacted in 1948, immediately the ANC is going to try to replicate many of Gandhi's ways in something called the Defiance Campaign, where there's going to be boycotts and sit-ins and civil disobedience. But that's not going to be successful. And in fact, many in the ANC, they're going to create a youth league, which is going to be much more proactive. And eventually that spins off into what's called the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, which is going to take a much more militant and aggressive stance against apartheid. Now, all of this is going to culminate in 1960 at a city called Sharpeville, where 69 unarmed black protesters are going to be shot by the white police. This is really going to create the conditions for an escalation in the violence. Now, following Sharpeville, the government's going to crack down big time. They're going to arrest 18,000 people. They're ban the ANC. They're going to ban the PAC. And then those groups are going to go really violent. Even Nelson Mandela, who's going to be awarded eventually the Nobel Peace Prize, took part in terrorist acts against people and government officials that supported apartheid. It was a group called the MK. That's going to get him arrested for sabotage, and he was even tried for treason, and get him his sentence where he's going to spend 27 years in jail and really become the Gandhi of that movement, even though Gandhi was all peaceful and Nelson Mandela is not exactly going to be peaceful all the time. By the 1970s, the ante is going up. There are more groups. The Black Consciousness Movement, one of their leaders, Steve Biko, is going to be beaten to death in 1977. And in 1976, we have a massacre at Soweto where hundreds of students were massacred by the white government. And at the same time, the groups that are opposing apartheid are now using terroristic methods in order to try to win the day as well. So internally, The civil disobedience isn't working. The terrorism really isn't working. So we're going to need some outside influence as well. Let's look at the outside opposition influences against apartheid. Internationally, there's not a lot of opposition to apartheid until we get to the 1960s. Now, in 1961, South Africa becomes a republic, and it wants to be part of the Commonwealth of Great Britain in order to get good trade relations. But the other countries that are part of that don't want anything to do with South Africa because of apartheid, so they have to withdraw from the Commonwealth. We have the United Nations following Sharpeville that is going to condemn apartheid in 1962, and then by 1963, they're proposing a voluntary arms ban against South Africa as well. And eventually there is going to be a call for countries to economically embargo South Africa. Now, the United Nations isn't able to do that because they have a Security Council where members have veto power. And Great Britain, under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, and the United States under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, isn't going to allow that economic embargo to occur because they still see South Africa through the eyes of free trade. They called it constructive engagement, that the best way to get rid of apartheid was to engage with South Africa, not to embargo them, not to withdraw. And legislative groups within the United States, specifically ALEC, they fought strongly to keep ties with South Africa. But as media increases and attention increases, there's a large calling that we need to stop doing business with South Africa. Not to mention other groups such as the Catholic Church. Pope John Paul spoke vehemently out against apartheid, and international groups, sporting groups like the Olympics. The South Africans weren't able to participate in the Olympics since the 1960s because of their apartheid policies. I think the key internationally is to understand a lot of countries are seeing this through the Cold War. Certainly Great Britain and Reagan with the United States is seeing this as a Cold War conflict. The ANC are communists. The South African government is our ally. But as the Cold War ends and more attention turns to the human suffering and the human costs of apartheid, there's more pressure put on South Africa to change. Now, what did South Africa do as all this tension was rising? Did they retreat from apartheid in the 1970s and the 1980s? No, they doubled down. They even worked with Israel to get nukes into South Africa. That's how nervous Nelly they are. But again, by the late 1980s, the walls are coming down, the Cold War is ending, and there's a lot of pressure for South Africa to change, and it's going to take an election to do it. So how did it end? It ended of their own accord. With the death of President Botha in 1989, the new president, F.W. de Klerk, is going to immediately take an aggressive stance that apartheid needs to end. He legalizes the ANC and the PAC. He immediately releases Nelson Mandela from prison. He starts negotiating with the ANC for an end to apartheid. They set up new elections, and by 1994, there is now universal suffrage, and there is a free election in South Africa where the former prisoner and ANC fugitive Nelson Mandela is going to be elected president. And then
apartheid in South Africa crumbled after Nelson Mandela walked to freedom. But black people suffered decades of government-backed injustice before it did. Apartheid really began in 1948, but separating black Africans from the white minority had long been a policy aim. Laws made white people officially superior, and the large black majority faced discrimination in every aspect of their lives. Living, doing business or owning land in white areas was banned. There were separate public facilities, transport and schools. Interracial marriage was banned. Many had no right to citizenship and were regarded as aliens in major cities. Instead, they were made citizens of Bantustans, homelands scattered throughout South Africa. But resistance grew. In 1960, a huge peaceful protest against past laws ended in a massacre at Sharpeville. 69 people were killed. The deaths galvanized opposition, radicalizing liberation movements like the ANC.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence.
Open conflict erupted in the 1980s, with anti-apartheid activists frequently shot at, beaten or arrested. Mass protests were firmly put down. But little by little, the apartheid establishment crumbled. After gradual reform, Nelson Mandela, imprisoned since not long after Sharpeville, was set free in 1990. 4 years later, he was elected as South Africa's first black president. Apartheid had ended.
Could you bring your face On April 27, 1994, Nelson Mandela cast his vote in the first free and democratic elections in South Africa, marking the official end to racial oppression and apartheid rule. Apartheid, a term we've heard before, but what exactly is it? The word itself stems from the South African dialect of Dutch Afrikaans and literally means apartness. But for millions in South Africa, it held a much darker reality. It was a system put in place by the Afrikaner National Party in 1948, which allowed for lawful segregation using racial divides.
Will you intensify your present policy of racial segregation?
The policy of, what do you mean by intensify? Whether any further measures are to come, it's impossible for me to say at the moment. I do not know of any.
The policy governed South Africa for nearly 50 years, but racial segregation existed long before apartheid even began. In 1913, the government passed the Natives Land Act, limiting black African land ownership to 7% and restricting them from buying or occupying land except as employees of a white master. More than 3 decades later, the practice of systematic racial segregation was given the name apartheid and was extended under the government led by the National Party. The party's goal was to separate South Africa's white minority from its non-white majority, in addition to separating non-whites from each other. They did this by putting in place hundreds of race laws touching every aspect of life, preventing equal opportunities for basic human rights to people of color, including dictating where they could live, work, go to school, all based on their race. Interracial relationships and marriages were illegal, and perhaps most importantly, non-whites did not have a right to vote.
All these laws after 1948 had one purpose in mind, and that was to ensure that the 4 million whites in South Africa had all the resources, the wealth, the jobs, the mines concentrated in their hands.
The Race Classification Act put people in 4 different categories: white at the top, followed by Indian, colored or of mixed descent, and black at the bottom. And within those groups were subgroups, further segregating ethnic and tribal groups. A number of pseudo-scientific tests were used to classify individuals suspected of not being European. For example, the pencil test. This involved putting a pencil in an individual's hair. If the pencil fell to the floor, they passed the test and were considered white. If it stayed put, they were considered colored. Black South Africans were forced to carry identification at all times known as a passbook. Resistance to apartheid laws came in the form of mostly non-violent political protests. Together, freedom fighters like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and Ahmed Kathrada started to play an important role for both the African and Indian National Congress parties. In 1952, they began a defiance campaign calling on people to purposely break apartheid laws in order to get arrested. People of color got onto white buses, used white toilets, and entered white areas. Their hope was that the high number of prisoners would cause the system to collapse. But it did not. Thousands ended up in jail. And in 1953, the Public Safety Act and Criminal Law Amendment Act were passed to impose even more severe penalties for demonstrating against the law. On March 21, 1960, a protest against the use of passbooks turned violent in the black township of Sharpeville, when police opened fire on unarmed protesters, leaving nearly 70 dead and 180 wounded, including children. A state of emergency was declared nationwide, and opposition political parties, including the ANC, were banned, forcing many to move their fight underground.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
By 1964, most resistant leaders, including Mandela, were sentenced to life imprisonment following the infamous Rivonia trials, which drew international attention. Eventually, a tide of global pressures put the government in a difficult position.
The world was changing. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and that was a major movement. There was increased calls for the divestment of companies from South Africa. There was a global movement to boycott South Africa.
Coupled with unrest within the country and the continued armed struggle, negotiations began between the ANC and the National Party. Slowly, apartheid began to dismantle. In 1990, at the age of 71, Nelson Mandela was released from prison.
I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people.
Elections were held 4 years later, with the ANC winning 62% of the vote and Nelson Mandela becoming president. The people of South Africa won their country back, and apartheid was abolished.
Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.
Racism has always been an issue in the world. One of the most horrible examples of racism was apartheid. Apartheid literally means apartheid or separateness. Segregation had began in South Africa ever since the Dutch first colonized there in the 17th century. However, apartheid did not fully come into legislation until 1948, when the all-white National Party of South Africa gained power. They immediately began enforcing racial segregation and discrimination against the blacks. They passed 317 laws that formally established institutional discrimination throughout South Africa. By 1950, any type of interracial sexual relations were strictly forbidden. The Population Act of 1950 categorized South Africans between whites, blacks, colored, or Asian. This policy often split families. Parents could be classified as white, while their children were classified as colored. Prime Minister Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd promoted a policy known as separate development, which created 10 homelands for blacks, and legalized the deportation of blacks to one of these homelands, essentially disenfranchising them. Between 1961 and 1994, more than 3.5 million black South Africans were deported to one of these homelands, where they lived in poverty and hopelessness. None of these policies came without resistance. The ANC, or African National Congress, which included Nelson Mandela, was the biggest opponent to apartheid laws. They tried peaceful resistance, however, nonviolence did not last for long. In 1960, the Sharpeville Massacre occurred. Police opened fire on protesters who were part of the ANC. 69 were killed and another 187 were wounded. The ANC faced another defeat when 4 years later, Mandela and other leaders were sentenced to life in prison on the charges of sabotage. With Mandela gone, more apartheid laws were passed, such as the 1970 Bantu Homeland Citizenship Act, which stripped 8 million blacks of their citizenship. In 1976, another violent outbreak occurred in Soweto. Police again attacked nonviolent protesters with tear gas and bullets. The official government death toll was 176. However, many believe the actual number of casualties to be somewhere around 700. This additional violent outbreak drew more international attention to South Africa and shattered all illusions that apartheid had brought peace or prosperity to the nation. Throughout this time, the United Nations was putting pressure on South African government to stop apartheid. In 1980, the UN Security Council officially condemned police violence in South Africa, calling the government to end apartheid, grant equal rights to all citizens, and release all political prisoners, including Mandela. In 1983, yet another anti-apartheid organization was formed, the United Democratic Front, or UNF, with Archbishop Desmond Tutu as one of the most influential members. He won the Nobel Peace Prize the year after for his efforts in stopping apartheid. However, the South African government wouldn't go down without a fight. In 1985, they declared a state of emergency in order to suppress the growing momentum of anti-apartheid movements. Troops were deployed to the black homelands, thousands of protesters were arrested, and most political organizations were banned. In response, the UK and United States placed economic restrictions on South Africa. For the first time, South Africa began relieving enforcement of some apartheid laws. All of this led to the election of F.W. de Klerk in 1989, who repealed the Population Registration Act and eliminated most of the legal basis of apartheid. In addition, he lifted the ban on the ANC and freed many political prisoners. In 1990, Mandela was finally freed after 27 years in prison. In 1991, apartheid laws were finally repealed, and negotiations occurred, pushing South Africa to a multicultural government. In 1992, Klerk and Mandela finalized the Record of Understanding, which called for a democratically elected government to create a new constitution. Mandela was later elected president in 1994, thus officially ending apartheid, one of the most heinous examples of racism in human history.
You had 2 thin pieces of wood, and you were smoothing them down with a knife. But when I asked you what you were doing, you just said, Wait and see, Henny. It was only when you tied the two pieces of wood together into a cross and put that down on the brown paper that I realised what you were doing. Sam's making a kite.
Ellie, it's your mother.
I brought Daddy home, Ellie. I'm warning you now, when the two of you start fighting again, I'm leaving home. Because it'll be at your purse before long. For money, for booze.
Ellie, stop. That's your father you're talking about.
Just leave me and my father alone.
I'm not the one saying terrible things about him.
And as far as my father's concerned, all you need to remember is that he is your boss.
Tell the boys when they're finished with the floors, they must clean the windows.
He isn't. I get paid by your mother.
He's a white man, and that's good enough for you.
What homework do you have? If we're not careful, somebody is going to get hurt. Come, Willie, let's finish up.
Why don't you start calling me Master Harold?
If you make me say it once, I'll never call you anything else again. I've also got a memory of a little white boy in short trousers and a black man flying a kite. Should we try again?
Try what?
Fly another kite, I suppose.
The implementation of apartheid policy in South Africa by the predominantly white National Party brought widespread racial discrimination, segregation, and inequality to its non-European, non-white peoples living within the state. Built into apartheid society was a number of policies, programs, and laws that safeguarded white supremacy and perpetuated racial segregation throughout South African society. South African education was no exception, in the sense that it was not immune to these racially polarizing procedures. Consequently, the white ruling party formulated a national policy of segregated schooling via state control of education, ultimately culminating with the institution of the Bantu Education Act of 1953. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 explicitly defined the world of South African education as an ethnic binary in terms of white and black. The National Party's stance on South African education is exemplified well by the following statement from Dr. H.F. Verwoerd, the Minister for Native Affairs in the National Party. The school must equip him to meet the demand which the economic life of South Africa will impose him. There is no place for the Bantu in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. This statement comes from Verwoerd's speech before the National Senate on July 7, 1954, and strongly illustrates the racist undertones built into the Bantu Education Act. Under the Act, the state-controlled system denied black people access to the same educational opportunities and resources enjoyed by white South Africans. It denigrated black people's history, culture, and identity. It promoted myths and racial stereotypes in its curricula and textbooks. African people and communities were portrayed as traditional, rural, and unchanging. Additionally, enormous disparities in funding between white and black schools and ridiculous student-teacher ratios adversely affected the quality of education. Overcrowded classrooms, inadequate instruction, shabby school buildings, poor teacher training, and a lack of textbooks and basic school supplies characterized Native African schools. So this all begs the question, how did the marginalized peoples of South Africa respond to these conditions? A debate broke out between the anti-apartheid resistors as to how the blacks should approach their resistance to this problem. The debates were essentially comprised of two camps, those in favor of a limited protest and those in favor of a permanent boycott. The ANC, the opposition party to the National Party, ultimately decided that an indefinite boycott was the right course of action. And so, on April 1st, 1955, the same day the education system was set to shift into the national government's control, a widespread boycott led by the ANC began. In order to realize success during this boycott, parents, volunteers, churches, and anti-apartheid officials had to take schooling into their own hands. To ensure confidentiality and secrecy from the National Party, improvised schools were called cultural clubs so that they would not attract attention from the national government. It's incredibly compelling to explore some of the sacrifices and efforts carried out by selfless individuals to ensure the continuation of children's learning in lieu of the act. Despite honorable efforts by parents, volunteers, churches, and anti-apartheid officials, the boycott ultimately had to cease to exist. Among other things, a major disadvantage for the resistors was the lack of funding and proper resources, and a failure to provide effective forms of alternative education. Additionally, the National Party issued a declaration which would prohibit boycotting students from ever being readmitted into South African schools. It's estimated that 3,000 to 4,000 students who participated in the boycott were not readmitted. And so, state control of the education system became a dominating feature of South African society for years to come. As time went on, these abhorrent conditions persisted, and frustrations amongst resistance groups had eventually reached its zenith, when in 1976, high school students in Soweto started protesting for better education. Police responded with tear gas and live bullets, among other things. It is commemorated today by a South African national holiday, Youth Day, which honors all the young people who lost their lives in the struggle against apartheid and Bantu education. Protest and resistance to inequities in education defined the remainder of apartheid society, and even though the 1994 democratic elections resulted in the creation of a single educational system, the effects of the Bantu Education Act are still felt today. According to the Journal of African Economies, written by Servaas Vanderberg, only 7% of formerly black schools graduate 80 to 100% of their students, while 98% of formerly white schools graduate 80 to 100% of their students. So as you can objectively see, the effects of Bantu education are still impacting South African education into the 21st century. And it's likely that it will take a considerable amount of time to undo the terrible effects that apartheid policy had on South African education. We've certainly come a long way, but there's still work to be done. Where do we go from here?
Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily, and perhaps much better, be described as a policy of good neighborliness. Accepting that there are differences between people. But while these differences exist, and you have to acknowledge them, at the same time, you can live together, aid one another, but that it can best be done when you act as good neighbors always do.
In 1950, the Group Areas Act is passed. This law helped establish particular neighborhoods according to racial groups. 1951 sees the passing of the Prevention of Illegal Squatters Act, a law that gave magistrates the power to remove blacks and demolish their housing structures without prior notice. The Bantu Authorities Act is also passed in 1951, giving some power to tribal authorities. In 1952, the Bantu Laws Amendment Act gave the then state the right to appoint and fire tribal chiefs. The Natives Land Act of 1913 is amended in 1964 to allow the abolition of labor tenancy by means of proclamation, meaning black tenants on white farms can now be classified as squatters. A temporary agreement is reached on the return of certain communities to their land in 1993. This ushers in a new dawn on the land issue.
In South Africa, from 1948 to 1994, a regime known as apartheid took hold. This government system involved white supremacists taking control of an overwhelmingly black-populated country. This new government segregated public facilities such as education and medical care. Similar to the Jim Crow laws in America, blacks were forced to be separate from whites with inferior facilities. This policy led to extreme poverty throughout the black population. New laws restricted blacks living in cities. They were forbidden to own their own homes in urban areas so they had to rent housing from local administration boards. The so-called black spots in South Africa's cities were wiped out because most blacks were forced to evacuate their homes. This included neighborhoods where people of different races had been living beside one another peacefully, like the black suburb called Sophiatown and the heart of the black community in Cape Town, which is also called District 6. With the new government, blacks now had to carry passports.
Crying somewhere, there's a child crying somewhere, there's a child crying for freedom in South Africa. Somewhere.
I come from a country where for the last 35 years millions of South Africans have been suffering under a system called apartheid. Apartheid is a cancer on the body politic of the world, a scourge on our society and on all humankind. Apartheid exists only because of economic greed and political oppression maintained by both systemic and physical violence and a false sense of racial superiority. So many have been forced into exile. So many have been thrown into jail. Too many of our children have been shot down mercilessly on the streets of our nation.
For freedom in South Africa.
The struggle to overthrow apartheid took half a century. It was a global movement inspired by the banned and exiled liberation leaders of South Africa, who appealed to the world to help bring democracy to their country. One nation in particular was of key importance.
What would you like to see the United States do that it is not doing now?
We want the United States to lead the West in action against Pretoria on the side of the victims of the apartheid system.
If the United States of America, economically the most powerful nation on earth, claims not to have the power to terminate the policy of apartheid, then there is something drastically wrong either with the nature of that power or with the ability or the willingness of your country and its people to utilize such power in the service of justice.
Crying for freedom, crying for freedom, crying for freedom, crying for freedom. I'm gonna take it.
In Cape Town itself is a sprawling vacant expanse known as District 6. What happened here is commemorated in the District 6 Museum.
You see, let me start from the beginning in saying that District 6 was almost the biggest area in District 6. Almost 70,000 people were removed from the area because of apartheid. Now, I think one of the reasons was also because the area was very cosmopolitan. Many whites lived here. We had a lot of Jews in District 6. We had blacks, Indians, Hindus, Portuguese, Chinese, Japanese, you name it, all kinds of people. And we were like one big happy family. I think that was a problem. The apartheid government, they didn't like that because we proved to them it can work. So in 1966, they declared District 6 a whites-only area. And then in 1970, they started bulldozing every single house and building. The day they bulldozed my home, I was actually watching them. I was standing right on the opposite side when they bulldozed my home. I was very sad. I was also angry, you know. I asked the man, why are you doing this to us, you know? But he said, sorry, that was his job, you know. He was ordered by the government to bulldoze everything. Many people died of broken hearts. You know, I remember my father was 60 years old when he had to leave his home and he cried. He didn't want to go because this was his home. But what was sad, you know, when people were moved out, the government then sort of split people up into different racial groups. Now, the term they used was colored. That's what they call us. All our people were moved 30 kilometers away, a place called Hanover Park, Mitchell's Plain. All the Indians and Hindus were moved to a place called Rylands. And then, of course, all the blacks were sent to the black townships, places like Langa, Nyanga, Gugulethu, and Khayelitsha. You know what was so sad also for me, a personal friend of mine, he was colored, his wife was black. In 1972, when they had to leave, his wife couldn't go with him, and they had 3 little kids. Unfortunately, all the kids were black, so the kids had to go with the mother to Langa, that's a black township, and he went to Mitchell's Plain. And that's what the government actually did to people, separate them from their own families. He couldn't see his wife. If he wants to see his wife, he's got to go to the police station and apply for a permit. And they will give him a permit every 3 months for 2 hours only. He didn't see his children grow up. And that's what apartheid did, not only to District 6, but throughout South Africa. People were practically kicked out of their homes because of the color of their skin.
The idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an idea for which I hope to live and to see realized. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
Apartheid is one of the most recent and most sophisticated systems of racial segregation in the world. Beginning relatively recently in 1948 and extending to 1994, this system resulted in the destruction of the rights of non-white people living in South Africa. The South African government's goal was to improve the welfare of the entire nation and to maintain their economic strength, and it did this by instituting numerous laws. The system came to be known as apartheid. In 1652, Jean van Riebeek, an employee of the Dutch East India Company, arrived in South Africa with the goal of establishing a settlement in between Europe and the Dutch East Indies. As the settlement in Cape Town grew, so did the Dutch's power in South Africa. The black natives initially mounted revolts and attacked the colonists, but they were unsuccessful because of the lack of modern weaponry. Furthermore, the discovery of diamonds and gold in South Africa furthered the interference of colonial powers. The British began colonizing the region, and following this colonization, the British entered 2 wars with the original Dutch colonists, called the First and Second Boer Wars. These 2 wars resulted in heavy British casualties, but because of the overwhelming numbers of the British in the Second Boer War, they won. Although Britain won the war, they gave control back to the Dutch. In 1905, a law had already been passed that limited the rights for blacks to vote. And 5 years later, in 1910, the Union of South Africa was officially formed. And in 1913, the Natives Land Act was passed, which restricted the amount of land that blacks could own. In 1948, Daniel Francois Malan was elected Prime Minister of South Africa, and shortly after, the first Grand Apartheid Law was passed. This law was called the Population Registration Act, and required all adults to carry identification cards that noted their racial group. To define people's races, the government separated everyone into 4 main races: whites, blacks, coloreds, and Indians. Blacks, which held the majority population in the country, received the most restricted rights. For example, in 1949, the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act banned interracial marriages, and in 1950, the Immorality Act made it illegal to have interracial sex. Also in 1950, the second major Grand Apartheid Law, the Group Areas Act, was passed. This law restricted interracial living, and it put blacks into townships, which are governmentally annexed areas. The average house in a township was tiny, had no plumbing, no electricity, and they were commonly made out of sheet metal. In 1953, the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act was passed, which segregated benches, buses, schools, and colleges. Similar to the Civil Rights era in America, whites-only signs and blacks-only signs were common. In 1953, the Bantu Education Act was passed, which officially segregated education. In both an entirely separate system of education for blacks, it was made to teach primarily manual labor skills used in mining. While all these laws were being passed, a resistance was mounting. In 1949, the African National Congress, or the ANC, became predominantly controlled by the Youth League, or the younger sector of the organization. These younger people decided that the only way to stop whites was to hold mass campaigns such as protests, strikes, civil disobedience actions, and boycotts. The goal of these were to be peaceful, but protesters often clashed with the police. Such was the case of the Sharpeville Massacre, which occurred on March 21, 1960, when about 6,000 protesters gathered at the Sharpeville Township Police Station. The protesters were angry about the requirement to carry their racial identification cards, so they were asking to be arrested for not doing so. The protest started off as peaceful, but it quickly intensified. The crowd grew to about 20,000, which was accompanied by 140 police reinforcements. Jets were flown low to try to scatter the crowd, but that only prompted stones to be thrown. Police say that rocks and other debris were thrown at them, which prompted them to open fire on the crowd. Almost 70 people were killed and about 180 were injured. This event sent a domestic and international uproar against the apartheid regime, which prompted many international protesters to join the anti-apartheid movement. One of the most famous members of the ANC was Nelson Mandela. Despite the fact that Mandela eventually turned toward peaceful protests only, his early years of activism were filled with violence. He even advised the group to begin an armed group of members. The ANC allowed Mandela to co-found a militant group called the Mkhonto weSizwe, which translates to Spear of the Nation, and was commonly abbreviated MK. This organization was responsible for bombings of military sites, transport lines, and other important sites of the government. His goal was not to kill anyone, but casualties did occur, which resulted in Mandela being wanted by the government for terrorism. Mandela was then brought to court and sentenced to life in prison.
This man went to jail, a very angry young activist. He came out someone who was magnanimous, someone who had a depth that he would not, I believe, have gained had it not been in this crucible of suffering.
While Mandela was in prison, another man was making his mark on South Africa. This man was named Stephen Biko. Biko started the South African Students Organization, or SASO. Following the creation of the SASO, Biko was banned from giving speeches and writing publicly. Despite the restrictions, Biko was able to help organize the Soweto Uprising, which is a group of protests held by high school students. During the protest, a line of police blocked the protesters' route, and according to an account of one of the policemen, some protesters began to throw rocks. The police then opened fire on the protesters, killing hundreds of children. Following this event, the United Nations, the United States, and many other countries formally condemned South Africa. Also, Stephen Biko was arrested, he was tortured, and eventually killed. In conjunction with many other events, the international community and even the South African government began to end apartheid.
Soon after I entered politics, and in my years as a backbencher already, I came to the realization it's not working. And especially since the early 80s, I became convinced that where we stand is morally indefensible, and that apartheid was wrong, and that it couldn't be improved, it had to be abolished. And I played a leading role in abolishing it. With the benefit of history, I made a profound apology in front of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, apologizing for the pain and the indignity that apartheid has inflicted on all people of color in South Africa, saying it was wrong. So, with the advantage of hindsight, apartheid should not have existed.
In 1990, after Nelson Mandela was freed from jail at Robben Island, he began negotiating with the government to end apartheid.
It was actually an extraordinary thing. You had to be pinching yourself to say, this is happening. I mean, here are these terrorists meeting with those who just a few weeks previously were hunting them down, had arrested many of them, and others were in exile.
Mandela primarily negotiated with the current South African president at the time, Frederick William de Klerk, between 1990 and 1994. At this point, the government was less reluctant to end apartheid because of the international outcry against the moral indefensibility of the concept and the numerous massacres that came with it. In 1991, the Convention for Democratic South Africa began in the Johannesburg World Trade Center, which fought to give all South Africans control over their nation. In 1992 and 1993, the negotiations continued that slowly brought down the old system of government in South Africa. Finally, in 1994, Mandela was elected as the first president of South Africa, and in 1996, almost all apartheid laws were removed.
This problem of racial discrimination is and was a worldwide problem. And therefore, it's not only in South Africa that self-examination and self-analysis must be done about what was wrong in the past. All the developed and former colonial powers should do the same inner searches of themselves.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we present to you another sad case in the history of the world, where races were oppressed, discriminated against, and unfairly treated.
The word apartheid means apartness in the language of Afrikaans. It also is the name that the white government of South Africa called its policy of racial segregation.
Apartheid was a practice of injustice that was exclusively in South Africa from 1948 to 1990. In 1948, the all-white National Party that controlled the South African government extended the policy of segregation and named it apartheid.
Petty apartheid, a branch of apartheid, is the law that prohibited most interracial social contact, gave authorization for separate public facilities, set education standards, established job restrictions by race, and denied non-white participation in the national government. Racial inequality was also part of the law. The government established by law that the separate facilities did not need to be equivalent. Grand apartheid, another branch of apartheid, was what geographically separated the racial groups. This was implemented with the Group Areas Act of 1950. It created separate residential and business sections in urban areas for each race. The only people allowed in each area were those of the same race or those that owned property there. Most of the land was for whites, which makes no sense, as they were the minority of the population. In this process, thousands of non-whites were forcibly removed from their homes to create white-only areas.
Apartheid quickly established stricter voting rights to decrease the power of other races that were not white. The Population Registration Act of 1950 assigned all South Africans an identity card that displayed their designated race. They were listed as either white, native, colored, or Asian.
Taking into consideration these crimes, the apartheid regime should be and would be denied by all mankind. The International Tribunal calls for unity of the progressive youth and students of the world supporting the struggle for liberation in Southern Africa. The tribunal demands immediate freedom to Nelson Mandela, leader of the freedom-loving people of South Africa.
We have made it very clear in our policy that South Africa is a country of many races. There is room for all the various races in this country. That it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed defense.
An impacting demonstration that was led by PAC happened in the black town of Sharpeville, where the police opened fire on the crowd, killing more than 60 people and wounding more than 180. After this incident, massive non-violent black protests erupted in several locations, leading the government to outlaw both the PAC and the ANC, using the army to crush resistance.
The importance of this incident is that it attracted international attention to South Africa's system of discrimination. The United Nations condemned apartheid by a 96-1 vote as, quote, reprehensible and repugnant to human dignity, and South Africa was forced to withdraw from the Commonwealth in 1961. Also, many countries applied economic sanctions against South Africa during the early 1960s.
A very cruel and unjust law was the Indemnity Act of 1961, which made it legal for police to torture and kill people while performing their duties. Later laws extended the power of the police by allowing them to arrest and detain people without trial and to deny them access to lawyers and to their families.
The people, naturally, grew tired of the situation and began to revolt against the government. One of the main groups that opposed apartheid was the African National Congress, or the ANC. The group was directed by Albert Luthuli, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and Nelson Mandela. The ANC sponsored nonviolent demonstrations, strikes, and boycotts from the 1940s through the 1950s.
In 1952, the ANC came together with the South African Indian Congress to start the Defiance Campaign. During this campaign, protesters burned their identity cards and defied the laws of apartheid peacefully. About 8,500 protesters were arrested. In 1955, the ANC and other groups had a meeting, which they named the Congress of People, which included blacks, Indians, people of mixed race, and sympathetic whites as well. The next year, the government charged more than 150 of the attendees with treason, but they were acquitted after a long trial in 1961.